The Coast Guard had no idea that this strange blue boat would soon become the center of a nightmare scenario when they intercepted it. None of their radars detected the blue metal boat. Furthermore, there was little they could do to prevent what happened when they entered the boat. About 3 miles offshore, during a routine inspection, the floating blue boat was spotted. At first, it appeared to be just a speck on the horizon, but one of the 7 Coast Guardsmen pointed at it and said, "Guys, there's something in the water over there." The team almost sailed past. As their own boat approached, the group quickly realized that the floating vessel was much larger than they had initially thought. The boat was very different from anything they had seen before. Their vessel's radar didn't seem to detect the boat at all. It was a mysterious boat. The crew captain looked at the monitor again, but for some reason, it only showed his own boat. Its blue color, which blended almost perfectly with the waves of the water, further reinforced this feeling. It made sense for the crew to call the person piloting the enigmatic boat to find out more. "Hey, this is the Coast Guard. Will a person in the blue boat come out and say hello?" There was a sense of tension in the air, and only by looking more closely could it be resolved. To attract the blue boat, the team immediately threw a rope with a hook on the end toward it. But that didn't go as planned either. Since the boat didn't seem very big, they could have approached it with a full crew of burly tractors. The captain's voice trembled, but the enigmatic object refused to move. Instead, they were pulled forward into their own boat. What is this thing? This case is more complicated than it first appears. When the 2 boats finally made contact, one of the crew members said, "We're only seeing the tip of the iceberg." But the captain ordered him and a colleague to investigate so that crew member would later regret this statement. The searching Coast Guardsman, Brendan, was worried, but he couldn't abandon his men while they watched. He crept to the tiny upper windows and cautiously took his first steps onto the blue boat. John, his partner and crew member, joined him, and they tried to peer inside. However, the view through the small windows seemed almost black, so they offered little visibility. They were left with only one option. "We have to open it," Brendan told his friend. John agreed, and together they lifted the boat's hatch. The boat's top hatch opened with a loud creak, revealing a staircase below. But the older sailors simply encouraged them. The fact that they couldn't see the ground made them even more anxious. Hoping their captain would call them back, the 2 men stared at him. "We're right here, so keep going." Brendan took a flashlight from his back pocket and used it to illuminate the area below him. Later, the 2 men bitterly regretted their decision to dive into the boat. When they reached the bottom, John and Brendan looked around with the flashlight. The inside of the ship looked even more dilapidated than the outside. Except for the center console, which looked like it had seen better days, everything was bare metal. "Who is the pilot of the ship, because there's no one here?" John asked, puzzled. With a shrug, Brendan tried to share his findings with the survey team. Over Brendan's shaky walkie-talkie connection, the words were difficult to understand. But things quickly turned dire. Above the 2 men, there was a creak, and then the upper hatch suddenly closed by itself. When the captain and other members of the coastal boat's crew noticed this, general fear spread. They tried to inquire about Brendan and John's condition, but the closed hatch completely cut off the contact signal. The 2 members of the survey team were separated from the rest of the group, and that was only the beginning of their difficulties, because immediately afterward, the boat began to vibrate violently. John and Brendan climbed the ladder and looked anxiously at their coastal boat. What the hell is going on? Unfortunately, the blue boat had a mind of its own and was beginning to dive completely beneath the surface of the sea. So this would be their only chance to see it. Despite his internalized panic, Brendan did his best to reassure his colleague. "John, calm down. Who does this if it's intentional? We're not sinking because the boat isn't taking on water." However, it seems that John wasn't reassured by this intentional remark. Brendan tried to remain calm for as long as possible, but the 2 men quickly gave in to panic. They hit the metal hatch of the ladder with the first one, but it wouldn't budge. It had no effect, and a few seconds later, the boat was completely submerged. The 2 crew members desperately tried to communicate with the main boat, but the signal was completely dead. And then Brendan realized something. This isn't just any boat, it's some kind of submarine. John nodded and agreed with this idea, but it didn't resolve their awkward situation. Brendan's thoughts returned to the time they had discovered the strange blue vessel. But why was this vessel so discreet? It was well camouflaged by its blue color and blocked all communication, so it didn't show up on radar. What was it for? The submarine was heading to an unknown location with serious consequences, and the 2 frightened Coast Guards would soon find out. But John and Brendan had no choice but to wait until then. They used this time to search for possible clues inside the submarine. The main console on the north side of the sub was the first area they examined. John, however, exclaimed something there. With its sturdy buttons and cables coming out the back, it looked like something out of an 80 Seconds movie. Yet the machine didn't seem to have any influence on any part of the spacecraft. "There's a door over here, Brandon!" Brandon looked at his comrade as he turned around. They had completely forgotten about that part in their panic. John was standing on the other side of the sub and pointing at a large entrance with a large metal handle attached to it. what could be causing them. Hoping that their combined strength would be enough to open this door, the two boys joined forces and began pushing the handle down. But this door seemed too strong for the two desperate boys to open, as did the hatch above it. As Brendan and John lowered their defeated bodies to the bottom of the submarine, it began to vibrate violently. It was the same vibration they had felt as they sank about 30 minutes earlier, but this time it was clearly going upward. "There's light coming through the top window," John said excitedly. But Brendan quickly put that excitement aside when he realized this whole trip probably wouldn't end well. Loud noises were coming from above the submarine, even though it was completely above sea level. "Someone's coming, so take cover," Brendan told his worried colleague. The two men jumped from their sitting positions and hid behind the console at the other end of the boat. No sooner had they reached their hiding place than the hatch on top opened. At that moment, 3 people climbed out and walked over to the closed door. However, when they got out, they were carrying heavy belongings. What was this place? Brendan was trying to find an explanation for all this, and his mind was racing. Brendan cautiously peered around the corner and observed how the suspicious-looking individuals entered the sealed room of the submarine without a single item. The tall, heavy-set men carried dozens of heavy items to the surface during their frequent ascents and descents. Brendan and John were lucky not to get caught during the operation, which lasted about 30 minutes. But that didn't mean the 2 Coast Guards were safe. Inside the submarine, silence reigned after the suspicious-looking men unloaded the contents. John and Brendan were afraid to speak. However, they both saw that the people had left the top of the boat open. They realized this was their chance to escape. The 2 boys knew what they had to do and climbed the ladder, Brendan leading the pack. The shore workers felt the cool ocean breeze on their faces as they emerged from the top of the boat. But that wasn't all, as the 2 men were immediately surprised by the boat's position. "Where the hell did we go with this boat?" John's voice trembled. But above them was a huge drilling platform supported by 4 enormous floating pillars. There was no land nearby. They were in the middle of the ocean. Brendan and John cautiously climbed the long ladder that connected the submarine to the main platform above. When they arrived, a big surprise awaited them. At the top of the oil rig, activity was intense. Workers were lifting crates and machines were transporting cargo from left to right. John and Brendan debated what to do next while hiding behind some large shipping containers. It was immediately clear that there was no oil drilling going on here. But what was the purpose of this floating bridge? The 2 men moved tactfully and discreetly through the area. Several times they were nearly caught. Finally, they managed to cross the platform unnoticed. Once, John tripped over a loose cable, and 2 employees looked behind them and almost saw them. After walking all the way around, they finally got a glimpse of the main event. While crouching behind a large container, Brendan noticed an elderly man who looked in his 60s. Compared to the other people at the station, he was well dressed, and the 3 people from earlier placed the pile of bulky packages at the elderly man's feet. They observed the leader taking a considerable amount of cash from one of the packages after tearing off the film that wrapped it.